We have finished looking at two of the important priestly offices, the high priest and the second in command, the captain of the temple. Tonight we're going to begin with just listing all of them, beginning with those first two, so you'll know what is involved, and we'll just see how far we can go with looking at some of them tonight. If we don't finish them tonight, then we will try to do that next time. They are in order of the power that they would wield. First of all, we have the high priest. Now, these are priestly offices. This does not concern people who may occupy something else, such as a role within the sects of Judaism. You can occupy both, as we'll see. But this specifically concerns priestly offices. You have to be a descendant of Levi, of the priestly tribe, before you'll fit here. The high priest would be in command. Number 2, the captain of the temple. Number 3, the director of the weekly course. Number 4, the director of the daily course. Number 5, the temple overseer. Number 6, the temple treasurer. Number 7, the ordinary priest. And number 8, the Levite. Now those are, as far as I know, the only 8 official offices into which these descendants of the man Levi can be divided. And they are in descending order of their importance and rank, from the high priest down through what, as we will see, was just the lowly Levite. The lowly Levite. And you would not be occupying several of these positions at the same time. You wouldn't be an overseer and a high priest, or you wouldn't be captain of the temple and an ordinary priest, or you couldn't be a Levite and director of the daily course. Those would all be impossible situations. These descendants of Levi would find themselves in one or the other of these offices, and you would have to be found somewhere here, or you wouldn't be a descendant of Levi. In other words, if you don't occupy any of these important positions of high priest through overseer, treasurer, and so forth, and not even just an ordinary priest, then you're just an ordinary Levite. Now, it's not as though they don't have any duties at all. They do have duties and functions and responsibilities, but they don't have a whole lot of power or prestige coming along with those. So we're on number 3 then tonight, the director of the weekly course. Very similar to the director of the daily course. But to know something about the director of the weekly course, we'll have to know something about the weekly course. And to know something about the weekly course, we're going to have to know something about number 7, the ordinary priest. So I would assume that our discussion on this matter tonight will end up including numbers 3, 4, and 7, just because those 3 happen to go together. They're separated by overseer and treasurer of the temple by power and prestige and importance. But numbers 3, 4, and 7, the 2 directors and the ordinary priest, go together because of the fact that they fit in certain priestly courses, as we'll see. Director of the weekly course, director of the daily course, and the ordinary priest, or priests, I should say, plural, who would function under them. Now, you will recall that chief priests is an interesting term in the New Testament. It's an unusual plural in the Greek, which literally means the high priest, but since there can only be one high priest, then we know that there's another way to explain this, and basically we've explained it as follows, that term refers to the reigning high priest, to any deposed high priests who are still alive, and to adult male members of important high priestly families. If you turn over to Acts chapter 4, I just want to show you this verse and explain the oppositional grammatical way in which this verse, or a couple of verses in Acts 4, have been set up, and it clearly identifies the truth of what we've been saying thus far about our understanding of this unusual plural in the Greek New Testament, chief priests. Now, chief priests would include everyone from number 1, or if we leave out the high priest as someone distinct, everything from number 2 through number 6 on your list. Or you could say from number 1, because the high priest, if we're not trying to distinguish, would also be considered a chief priest. Everything from number 1 through number 6, these would be a member of this group that we come across so often in the New Testament, the chief priests. That would be the high priest, the captain, both directors, the overseer, and the treasurer. With the high priest, we know who that is, plus deposed priests, high priests who aren't here on our list, but they would be discussed under having been a high priest in the past. That would mean captain of the temple, both of the directors, the overseer, and the treasurer. Those would be adult male members of important high priestly families. If you've been wondering what I meant by that big, long, however general description, adult male members of important high priestly families, here they are: the captain, the 2 directors, the overseer, and the treasurer. Those would be the most important, along with the high priest, reigning and deposed members of the priestly aristocracy. So numbers 2 through 6 are very important, very coveted positions. Now, especially numbers 3 through 6 don't pop up in the New Testament. We've seen captain of the temple does. Or we could say it more generally, numbers 2 through 6, these important coveted positions are not seen very much in the New Testament. But they are in existence. In some places we can see that they are in existence, that they are the scene that exists behind the New Testament. We can find references to them in Jewish writings, and we simply need to understand, as I've said before, that this is a very coveted position these people are occupying. It amounts to an old boys club, a fraternal organization of those who are in. And if you're in, then you're part of this club of the chief priests, where people are appointing friends and relatives. There are a lot of backroom deals and a lot of back scratching taking place. It is simony and nepotism gone to seed, I would say here, as I've described to you before. And I think Acts chapter 4, verses 5 and 6, these verses really confirm this fact. In verse 5, and we'll be getting a little ahead of ourselves just to say this now, but we'll come back and say more about it in another connection. Verse 5 gives us the typical threefold makeup of the Sanhedrin. You don't find that term Sanhedrin or council that often in the New Testament. But it appears in other ways than just having to have one of those words be seen on the page. Acts chapter 4 and verse 5 is a reference to the Sanhedrin, but not by name as we would expect, the council or the council of the Jews or the Sanhedrin. It appears under a very typical way, and it's a typical threefold makeup of the Sanhedrin, referred to as the rulers, the elders, and the scribes. The rulers, the elders, the scribes. Now I think on your outline, scribes is the next thing we're going to get to whenever we're through with the priestly offices. But what about this business of rulers and elders? Where would you put these 8 functions I've just given to you? Where would you put them? Under rulers or under elders? Or part under rulers or part under elders? Well, we'll discuss those words more later on. We'll see who fits under those different groups. And then, of course, we'll have to deal with the scribes separately. But that is the typical threefold makeup of the Sanhedrin. They're designating the Sanhedrin under that terminology: rulers, elders, scribes. Now, with verse 6, Luke does not intend for us to understand that he's going on now just to mention a group of other people that aren't related to verse 5. It would look like that with maybe the way we have it in the English. It came to pass on the morrow that their rulers and elders and scribes, and if we keep on reading, and Annas and Caiaphas and John and Alexander, we've got a list of, about a half a dozen or more things here, which would mean that Annas, Caiaphas, John, Alexander, and so forth could not be included in one of those 3 groups, rulers, elders, scribes, because we just have a list here. We've got the rulers, the elders, the scribes, and we have Annas and Caiaphas and so forth. Well, what you have in the Greek is what we call an oppositional structure. I've used that word before. It's a grammatical term, spelled with an A and not an O, but it sounds like opposition. Opposition. It's spelled with an A and not an O. An oppositional structure. You can look it up in a dictionary to see what the word technically means, but I'll tell you what it means here in this particular case. Luke, with his oppositional arrangement, is showing that verse 6 is simply an enumeration of the members of the first of those three orders he mentions in verse 5. Now you can do that in English as well. You just have to understand what's being done. We are not to join verses 5 and 6 together and have number 1, rulers, number 2, elders, number 3, scribes, number 4, Annas, number 5, Caiaphas, and so forth, if you're following what I'm saying. We would have this, rather. Number 1, rulers, number 2, elders, number 3, scribes, number 1A. We're back to 1 again. We're back to that term, rulers. It's called an opposition, A-P-P-O-S-I-T-I-O-N, an oppositional grammatical arrangement. We're back to rulers in verse 5. Rulers 1, elders 2, scribes 3, and then verse 6 goes back under number 1. So I've just told you anyway where these people in verse 6 fit, as well as some of these numbers of the 8 that I've just given you, where they fit. They're not scribes, they're not elders, rather they're rulers. Or they're chief priests. Those are synonymous terms then. Rulers and chief priests would be synonymous terms. So make sure that you understand that. The English could be a little confusing in verses 5 and 6. That verse 6 isn't going on to list other people that are not related to verse 5, but he's given us the threefold designation of the Sanhedrin, rulers, elders, scribes. Now he goes back to mention by name some of the members of that class called the rulers. And who do we find? What do we find in verse 6? Well, here's what we find. We find 5 different things mentioned. You've got the Sanhedrin mentioned under its threefold designation. The most important, and the first one, would be ruler, the rulers. Then in verse 6, we're given 5 members of that group called the rulers. 5 members. Member 1 is the former high priest, whose name was Annas. Luke calls him high priest because he had a very privileged position and he was still the ruling force behind the scenes. But technically he was not. Technically he is not the high priest. Caiaphas is. That brings us to number 2. The current high priest is one Joseph Caiaphas. Then 3, we have John. Now, as I've said before, if the Western reading is correct, then we have Jonathan. And if the Western reading with Jonathan is correct, then what we have here is a son of Annas who succeeded his brother-in-law Caiaphas, who's current high priest at this time, as high priest. Now, that's only if the Western reading is true, and we couldn't prove that. If the Western reading isn't, this is simply an unknown John. But we know that he's related somehow to the rest of these guys in this business of nepotism and simony. Now, I've said that for a reason to tie our study tonight into what we said last Friday night. If the Western reading is right, if this is Jonathan, then he does succeed. He's the son of Annas, so we're part of the whole family tradition here. He does succeed his brother-in-law, Caiaphas, as the next reigning high priest. Well, what would that make Jonathan at this time that Acts is being written then? The captain of the temple guard. Remember, if that could be arranged, and it couldn't always be, but if it could be, then you had to, first of all, before serving as high priest, you had to serve as the captain of the temple guard. And I just find that interesting, since this very chapter, as well as the next one, are the 2 places here in Acts where the captain of the temple guard happens to be mentioned. Maybe that's why his name is thrown in here, again, assuming that the Western reading is right, and it's Jonathan and not just a plain John. That would make a lot of sense to me, that they mention him, Luke mentions him by name, Jonathan, the Western reading, knowing that his readers will understand, if they know anything of the background of the Jewish arrangement here, that this man, since he's going to become, and you'll be reading the book later on, he's going to become high priest, then surely he must be the captain of the temple guard at this time. Then the fourth man is an unknown Alexander. He doesn't appear to be anyone else who's mentioned in the New Testament, such as an enemy of Paul's who went by the same name. They're not related. An unknown Alexander. And then number 5, we just simply have an unnamed other group of family members. As many as were of the kindred of the high priest. So what you have here is a term that often appears in church history. You might not be familiar with it, but nepotism. Nepotism and simony. Simony is actually taken from the Bible. Simon. Everybody uses that, even in a secular world, but they took it from Luke's writing of Simon the magician in Acts 8, wanting to buy, let me buy, I want to purchase with money this power, so that upon whomsoever I lay my hands, they too will receive the Holy Spirit. And Peter said, your money's going to perish with you, because you thought that the gift of God could be purchased with money. Nepotism, of course, comes from a word that means nephew, refers to giving privileges or especially offices in government or in religion to relatives. And this takes place just all the time, in religion and politics and whatever. You give positions to relatives. Now, if relatives are deserving of the position, that's okay. But how many times are they? How many times can you have the father of the family is really a great political figure, and so is the son, the nephew, an uncle, a grandfather, a niece? How often is that really true? Now, if it is true, then, may the best man or the best woman win. But oftentimes it isn't true. It's just family privileges. Simony refers to the buying and selling, especially of church offices, the buying and selling. The buying and selling, you can't buy or sell church offices. But they did, and probably still do, but they've done it right down through church history. Those are two words that often appear, especially in good discussions of Roman Catholic Church history, because they were prone for falling for simony and nepotism. All the important positions were filled by family members, and maybe even sold to family members. They really have a heart for one another. Well, anyway, we want to look at numbers 3, 4, and 7 tonight. Director of the weekly course, director of the daily course, and the ordinary priest. You'll see why we have to mention them together, because the directors of numbers 3 and 4 come from the group called the ordinary priests. So we have to understand one to understand the other. So let's begin really with the ordinary priest. We'll understand who he is and what's going on, and that'll help explain what the courses are, the weekly and the daily courses, and then to find out who the director is will be easy. He's just the man over that. Now, the ordinary priest was a descendant through the tribe of Levi, of Aaron, a descendant of Aaron, but not from the son of his from whom the high priest came. This is just the ordinary priest. Now, this is rather elementary, but some people, I'm convinced, are confused over this. They're confused over the descent of the high priest, the descent of regular normal priests, and the descent of the Levite. These are not the same. We have a broad umbrella that begins, and then is going to, we've got this whole tribe of Levi up here, and one of the descendants of Levi is Aaron, and so we've got various other sons of Levi from whom various people can descend, and then we've got 4 sons of Aaron, 2 of whom are killed. That leaves us with 2 sons of Aaron, one of whom is the son that becomes high priest, and so his descendants can fill the role of high priest, which leaves us another son over here that would be the man from whom all of the ordinary priests have descended. So that maybe is a little schematic diagram to show you the relationship of these things. Now, these ordinary priests, don't just think they've descended only from Levi. They descended from Aaron. They actually come from the man who was the first high priest, but not from his son who was high priest after him. They were grouped in various priestly clans. There were thousands of them, of course. And they were grouped in various priestly clans who only occasionally ever even saw the city of Jerusalem. In other words, unlike the high priest and the captain of the temple guard and so forth, the ordinary priest did not occupy a permanent position within the temple. As a matter of fact, he rarely ever saw the temple. So we're not to think of the priest as being, just the underlings of the high priest and captain of the temple guard who were just congregating around the temple all the time to perform all of these duties and rituals. The ordinary, typical John Smith, John Doe high priest would rarely ever see the temple, would rarely even have an opportunity to function there. He was not stationed permanently there. They were grouped in various priestly clans, most of which were spread throughout Judea and Galilee. Now, they wouldn't, of course, be in that central section called Samaria. They wouldn't be allowed to live there, and they wouldn't want to live there. But they would be spread throughout the other two divisions of Palestine, the southern position of Judea and the northern one of Galilee. What would they do here? Well, they'd be making a normal, regular living. Generally, they would work at a manual trade, such as a farmer or carpenter, and so forth. So the ordinary priest, that's why I call him ordinary. He didn't really have such an outstanding role to play here. He's not like the high priest with all of his garbs, or the captain of the temple guard that controls the police force there, and he didn't get to see the temple every morning when he woke up and function there. He raised livestock, vegetables. He was a maker of chairs or built mud houses or something most of the year. He had to somehow make a living, and that is how he made his living most of the year. And then on a few occasions, as we'll see, he actually was allowed to come to Jerusalem and function in a priestly capacity there. These ordinary priests, however, are not part of the priestly aristocracy. We have to go up one number to number 6, where we stop the number of those who fulfill the chief priests. The chief priests function in the New Testament. They are not part of the priestly aristocracy. As I say, ancient tradition had them dispersed in various priestly clans. The number of these clans varied over time. For instance, in Nehemiah's day, in chapter 10, either verse 3 through 9, or you can back up to 2 or get the end of verse 1, people count either 21 or 22 courses or clans of priests. It kind of depends on whether you take that last name up in verse 1, I believe, Zedekiah, as being one of those, and you end up with 22 courses. If you don't, you have 21. In Nehemiah chapter 12, verses 1 to 7, and then you compare that with verses 12 through 21. So it's a little confusing over there in Nehemiah with his genealogies. There we definitely have 22 clans or courses of priests. And you compare the names between chapters 10 and 12, and about half of them are the same. Some of the names in chapter 10 appear again over in chapter 12. Let me just show you that before we go on, although it's not important for our study at all, but you probably would have missed it just in reading Nehemiah, what actually he's setting up. Let's start with chapter 10. In the end of chapter 9, they're sealing an important covenant here, and we see that the ones who do the sealing are important religious people. The last verse in Nehemiah 9. Because of all this, we make a sure covenant and write it, and our princes, Levites, and priests seal unto it. 3 different groups here. Our princes, those in a political, just purely governmental position, then religious people, Levites, and priests seal unto it. And in chapter 10, he's going to give us some of those who seal. He's going to give us the priest first, then the Levites, and then the princes, just the reverse order of those 3 groups as they're enumerated in verse 38. The priests first, then the Levites, and then the princes. Verse 1, now those that sealed were Nehemiah the Tirshatha, which just means the Persian word for the ruler of the people. And so he's really not counted now in this first group. He's just the one who presides over the ceremony. the son of Hakaliah, and Ziddah or Zedekiah, or Zidkiah or Zedekiah or Zedkiah, depending on how you spell it. And then, beginning with verse 2, Sarai and Azariah and Jeremiah and Pashur and Amariah and so forth. You've got a list of people. Now you may, if you include Zidkiah in the end of verse 1, then you've got 22 courses here. But look at the end of verse 8, this little phrase here, these were the priests. Well, that doesn't just mean that there were 22 priests in Israel at this time. What he means there is that these were the heads, the names of the men who were the heads of the priestly courses or tribes. As we'll see here in a moment, they would essentially function as the director of the weekly course, although that's really New Testament era terminology. That's essentially how they would function. These were the priests. Well, not the priests, but these were the heads of the priestly clans. These were the men who were the heads of the priestly clans. Then verses 9 through 13, you have a list of the Levites. Then starting with verse 14, of course, you have the princes, called the chief of the people here. And then you can see it over in chapter 12. Well, the important thing, though, to remember is that way back in David's time, the number of the courses had been established. All the priests, descendants of Aaron, had been divided into a certain number of courses, and that number had been established at 24. That number had been established at 24. You say, why 21 or 22 in Nehemiah 10 and definitely 22 in Nehemiah 12? Well, no one knows, but they fluctuate over time. But the original designation, according to 1 Chronicles 24, was 24. 1 Chronicles 24, verses 1 to 19. That's the best passage there. 1 Chronicles 24, verses 1 to 19, gives the names of the heads of the 24 courses of Jewish priests. And it was this number 24 that prevailed in Jesus' day. So in other words, what I'm saying is in Jesus' day we have not 21 or 22, but 24 courses of priests, into which all of the various priests who were alive at that time, who had descended from Aaron, would be divided. I guess you can, some of you are looking like, what's a course of priest? Well, you could take anything as a comparison, but what comes to my mind is maybe like a city softball league. You've got X number of people in the city who want to play softball, that softball season. And so you have so many teams that represent the tire company or electronics store or the drug store or something like that. You have so many teams with so many members, and then you've got a captain on all those teams. So those teams representing all the people in that city who want to play softball in the summer softball league, that would be equivalent to the priestly courses. You'd have so many priests, we'll get to how many there were alive at this time, and then they would all have been divided, and it would be according to their descent, according to their heritage. So some tribes, if they had been afflicted in war or by disease or something more heavily than another course, then they might not have as many members now. That would fluctuate. The population in any course would fluctuate over time. It wouldn't be equal, that's for sure. But those softball teams would represent the situation that we're talking about right now. So many priests, so many people who want to play softball, divided up into so many teams so you can have competition. Now, the purpose here wasn't competition. The purpose here was to serve at the temple. Not everyone could serve all the time. So we'll divide them up, and they serve at their appointed season. And what was that? Well, each of the 24 courses did service at the temple in Jerusalem 1 week, twice a year. Now that's probably true even in David's time. You see, it'll give you a better understanding and picture of the priest here. We have so many priests who are alive. There's no way they could all get in and function at the temple at one given time. That'd be impossible. That'd be like everybody in a town or city wants to play softball playing all at the same time. That's impossible. Why do they even dream up a softball league? So we can get the people divided up and we can have some harmony and some order here. If everyone wanted to come to the field at the same time, you'd have maybe 200 people at bat against 200 people in the field. And I don't know if you'd ever get a hit out there, not with 200 people out there. Well, the same is true here at Jerusalem. We can't just think of the priests like there were 15 or 24 or 87 and they could all function there. There are thousands of them. They can't all function there at the same time. But being priests, they would want to function, so it's only fair to get them divided up and let them function accordingly. Now, this doesn't go back to the days of Aaron and Moses. This isn't Levitical law. This isn't Mosaic legislation here. Why? They don't have the need then. You don't have all the descendants. You've got a lot of Levites. Now, they're divided up, to be sure. The Levites are divided up in the law of Moses, not the priests, though. Why? You don't have any priests. You have Aaron the high priest and 2 of his sons. 2 are killed. That leaves him 2 sons. So, in the beginning you've got 1 high priest and he's got 2 men who work under him, his 2 boys, the only 2 who are alive. It's going to take a lot of time for them to marry and produce children, and those children to marry and produce children, and those children to marry, and so forth. So you don't have any legislation given back in the law of Moses because you don't have any need for it then. Whenever we move 400 years later, we come to the time of David. We have such a large number of men who have descended from those 2 sons, really 1 son, of, 2 sons, because only one of the firstborn of the son of the important important son who functioned as high priest after Aaron could be high priest himself. He's got brothers who can't be. So their descendants will become priests, and it just begins to multiply. By David's time, we have enough to necessitate them being divided up and parceled out into courses. So these courses would function in Jerusalem 1 week, twice a year. That means they'd have 2 weeks, 2 non-consecutive weeks, though. 1 week, twice a year. Well, that's 2 times 24 gives us 48 weeks, or 52 weeks in a year. So who's going to function there that other month that we have, the other 4 weeks? Well, that would essentially be taken up with the 3 annual festivals.
For the continuation of this
taken up with the 3 annual festivals when all of the priests were required to be present. They couldn't all fit in the court of the priests, but they could all fit around there and function as opportunity arose. That takes care of a whole year. 24 courses who function 1 week, 2 times in the year, gives us 48 weeks where we have these courses functioning in Jerusalem. The other 4 weeks basically are taken up with the time necessary for the 3 annual festivals of Passover, Pentecost, and the Feast of Tabernacles. Now, connect this knowledge with our knowledge of the size of the temple and some of the functions that we studied back when we studied the temple. So many animals are being killed. Let me bring it down to what some of us have been doing, building our home, what some of you do for a living. How long, if you're pounding nails in manually, how long can you really swing that hammer until you've lost oxygen in your blood in your arm? You ever swung very long? You can only pound so long. You've lost oxygen. There's no oxygen in your blood. In that arm becomes just like a noodle. Think if you're slicing open animals and flaying them and emptying buckets of blood, you can only cut so long. So we need thousands of men available at the time when we've got so many pilgrims there, people who've come back to Jerusalem to sacrifice and to worship. Now, still, even at one given time there, not all the men could fit in there and function. But they could go home or go to where they'd be staying there in the city and sleep for a while and then come back and relieve one of their comrades. So it was a relay duty, we could say. Jeremias has estimated, and it's just an estimation, that the number of priests in the 1st century A.D. was about 18,000. There were about 18,000 ordinary, regular, normal priests who would be functioning or who would desire to function and to serve in the temple liturgy in Jerusalem. All right, now that gives you a little of the background of the priests and how they're divided up, according to 1 Chronicles 24, verses 1 to 19. So that takes us then back to number 3 in our list of these leaders, the director of the weekly course. Notice the last word, course. That's what we've been discussing. What is a priestly course? director of the weekly course. Weekly course, we've seen they serve 1 week twice a year. So you can already put your own definition down to who the director of the weekly course is. He obviously must be the man who's in charge of that course of priests for that week they're at the temple. And that's what he is. The director of the weekly course would be the priest responsible for seeing that the incoming and outgoing of priestly courses ran smoothly. He also was the one, so there'd be a large number of directors of the weekly course. Well, you'd have as many as you have courses. So don't think now, again, if you go back to that number 8, we've got 8 people who make up, the chief priesthood. We've got more than that. You got 24, at least, directors of the weekly course. And sometimes you'd have a different director of the weekly course for the second time that year that course came to serve. Well, that would, if we do that for every course, each time they came, well, in 1 year, you'd have at least 48 directors of the weekly course. If they happen to change the next year, well, you'd have more. But, of course, that wasn't the case. Generally speaking, in any given time, you'd have 24 directors of the weekly course. Now, he would probably be stationed at the temple permanently. He would be from one of those courses. He would be the head of that course. But he would be stationed back there at the temple permanently. He didn't go back home to Galilee or to some Judean foothill with a manual trade in mind. He's too privileged to do that. He stays right here. Now, he performed the rites if it was his week when he was on call, when his course was serving, let's say, the first week of March. When his course is serving, then he becomes director of the weekly course. He's only that director for 7 days. And then your week is over with, and you go out, and another director of the weekly course takes over for a new course of priests which has come in. But while he was director, he would be the one who performed the rites of purification for lepers. Remember when Jesus said, "Go show yourself to the priest"? Here's one of those places where we probably have an indirect reference to the director of the weekly course. Go show yourself to the priest. When he healed the lepers, he said, go show yourself to the priest. Well, which one? Well, the director of the weekly course and those that would work under him. So there, I think, is probably a reference to the director of the weekly course, but not by that name. And also, he would be the one responsible for performing the rites of purification for women after childbirth. So there are perhaps 2 situations in the New Testament where the director of the weekly course appears. I've already mentioned one, lepers, the other, women after childbirth. Luke 2, verses 22 to 24, Mary herself came to the temple after the birth of Jesus. Luke 2, verses 22 through 24. Who was that priest that received her offering, recognizing her purification? Probably the director of that weekly course of priests. He's not called anything there. He's just a man, a priest, who functions at the temple. But he's probably the director of the weekly course. He also was the one who would give the water of bitterness in the trial of jealousy. Book of Numbers. We don't see that duplicated anywhere, practiced in the Old Testament, and we don't know whether it was or not. It doesn't appear in the New, though. He would be the one who gave the water of bitterness in the trial of jealousy, and each course would have its own director. Okay, then look at number 4 on your list, the director of the daily course. Okay, we would explain that this way. It becomes a little complicated, sorry about that, but at least I've done the mathematics for you, and you don't have to divide and multiply all of this. Each priestly clan, or weekly course, whatever you want to call it, we're calling them courses now, but you could call it a priestly clan, but each, and there are 24 of those, according to 1 Chronicles 24. Each of those 24 courses was divided into X number of families of priests who were responsible only for their given days during their course's given week at the temple. And it appears as though there were anywhere from 4 to 9 families or divisions within the courses. Let's just do an umbrella again to make sure I'm not losing anyone. We'll call this our 24 courses, and so we've got 24 of those. You can count on to 24. And then here's one, this is course A over here. Then it would be divided up, and they would serve 1 week. This course right here would serve January 1 to 7. They'd serve 1 week at the temple. Well, we're going to find out how many men were in this course. Still too many to perform the duties that need to be done in an off-peak season, as it were. And so this first course, course A, would be divided up anywhere from 4 to 9 families. So that family 1 might be assigned, Monday, and family 2 maybe Tuesday and Wednesday, or maybe Tuesday and Friday or something, and then the next one Thursday, and so forth. And only those families from that course would function whenever their day came around. And the days would fluctuate, as does the number of families, anywhere from 4 to 9. And so the director of the daily course would be the one over each of these families, which would mean we have a lot larger number of directors of the daily course versus directors of the weekly course. Weekly course, we know what we have, 24 of them. Daily would be, 24 times however many families we end up with, which would give us a large number of them. Now, why they don't just go ahead and have 7, since there's 7 days in a week, 7 families in a course, I don't know. We find some courses with as few as 4 families. That would mean several of those families are going to have to function on several different days that week. We find other courses that have as many as 9 families. That would mean on some trips down to Jerusalem, at least a couple of those families wouldn't get to function at all. Are you following the math of all of this? Okay. So let's do some of the math then. Since the division into families would vary anywhere from 4 to 9, let's just take 6.5 as the average. If 6.5 is the average number of families we have per priestly clan or weekly course, that would give us approximately 156 daily courses. 156 daily courses, all right? That would be all of these tentacles here. So forth. All for your 24 courses. If you've got 6.5 families, just multiply 6.5 times 24. You have approximately 156. You could round it off and just say 150 daily courses. Which would mean what? 2 things. Number 1, you'd have 150 directors of the daily course. You'd have 150. If you've got that many daily courses, you've got to have directors over those daily courses. Again, I can give you a real easy and rather profane analogy. What happens if you're in construction or something? At the end of the day, somebody has to be responsible for getting tools together and make things are cleaned up and this is put away and lights are turned off or this is locked, or somebody's got to be responsible for doing that. That'd be called the director of the daily course there. The one responsible just for his little group. And then someone else is responsible for all of those little groups that come in and work Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, Saturday, Sunday at a given place. So there's another analogy. And it would mean something else. 150 daily courses aren't enough to take care of all the days of the year, which would mean that many of these would function on at least 2 days during their week. And maybe even more. Some might function more than 2 days during their given week. 2 non-consecutive ones, but their given week at the temple. And then, of course, a few of them would just be completely left out. Those courses divided into 8 or 9 families would have 1 or 2 completely left out. Now, if you've got your Bible, turn over to Luke chapter 1. Luke 1, verses 5 to 23 is really the only important place in the New Testament. I say important because we've mentioned the purification for lepers and women after childbirth and so forth, little things. But the only major important place in the New Testament where this information that I've just given you becomes important or really figures in is Luke 1, verses 5 to 23. We're not going to read all of this, but we're going to read a little bit of this. Now, the story concerns Zechariah, who's a priest, and his wife Elizabeth, and their desire to have a child, a son. And they're, of course, granted one. Their prayers are answered. An angel is sent to tell them that their prayer has been answered. And we know, basically, I think, the story that is unfolded here in Luke chapter 1. But we want to see how that ties in with what we've been studying thus far this evening. Let's start with verse 5 in Luke 1. And remember what I said on Wednesday night in New Testament introduction, that Luke's gospel is that which portrays Jesus Christ as the Son of Man. The Son of Man, the one who has come to set free the meek and the lowly. And it's almost as though in verse 5, which is really like the first verse, the first four are just a preface, a prologue. The first verse of Luke's gospel, he has the irony here of setting this lowly, ordinary priest and the tremendous revelation he was given, a direct appearance of God's angel, Zechariah here, over against the man who was king in that day. He didn't get any appearances. There was in the days of Herod, the king of Judea, a certain priest named Zechariah. S's in the KJV New Testament equal H's in the KJV Old Testament. Zacharias was Zechariah, as we saw him in the Old Testament. A certain priest named Zechariah, and look at this, of the course of, the Old Testament name is Abijah, A-B-I-J-A-H, not Abiah, but Abijah, A-B-I-J-A-H. You'll recall in Biblical Lit and KJV studies that they have a big difficulty going from Hebrew to English versus Greek to English here. And they get the Greek and the Hebrew all confused, and you can't even recognize the English then. You have a lot of that in Luke's Gospel. Zechariah of the course of Abijah. All right, that was one of those courses that we've just been talking about. As a matter of fact, it was the 8th priestly course, or we could call it a weekly course. It was the 8th priestly weekly course, according to 1 Chronicles 24, named after one of their important early leaders, Abijah, A-B-I-J-A-H, of the course of Abijah, and his wife was of the daughters of Aaron. Well, that's rather unique. A priest didn't have to marry a descendant of a priest, but he did. He married Elizabeth, who was a woman of priestly descent herself. And before we read any further, skip all the way over to verse 39. Now here's what we find out about Zechariah. If you read Luke 1 carefully, you get all this in. Is Zechariah stationed permanently at the temple? Does he live in Jerusalem? Certainly not. Not according to the knowledge I've just given you tonight. They're scattered throughout Judea and Galilee. And they come to Jerusalem 2 weeks out of the year, 2 non-consecutive weeks out of the year, to serve and to function, plus at the 3 annual feasts. Where does he live? Does he live in Jerusalem? No. Verse 39 proves that. Mary arose in those days, after the angel has appeared to her, and went into the hill country with haste into a city of Judah, and entered into the house of Zechariah. Zechariah doesn't live in Jerusalem. Most of the ordinary priests don't live in Jerusalem. They are scattered throughout Palestine, and they ply some manual trade. He lives somewhere in the Judean hills outside of Jerusalem. Most people have hypothesized anyway southeast of Jerusalem, somewhere in the Judean hills. That is hill country. Due south is flat desert. Southwest is flat desert. Southeast is hill country. So probably this was in some little town. We're not even told the name of the town. It's just into a city of Judah, into the house of Zechariah, and she salutes Elizabeth. You remember whenever we studied in the, I guess that was also in Biblical Lit, we looked at the Apocrypha, and we looked at 1st and 2nd Maccabees. One of the important figures there was the priestly leader Mattathias. That was the father of Judas Maccabeus and Jonathan Maccabeus and Simon Maccabeus and so forth, the Hasmonean dynasty. Well, I often refer to Mattathias, as do most people, as Mattathias the priest of Modine. Mattathias the priest of Modine. Well, look what you just said. He doesn't live in Jerusalem. 1 Maccabees chapter 2 and verse 1 for a reference. Mattathias the priest of Modine. M-O-D-I-N. 1 Maccabees 2:1. Another reference that we have, and here's one again in the Bible, Luke 10 and verse 31. You don't need to turn there, I can tell you the story. Luke 10:31 will also prove that the priests don't live at Jerusalem. This is the account of the Good Samaritan. And you have the man who's been beaten and robbed, and you've got different men who walk by him. The Samaritan finally stops, and one of those who walks by him is a priest on the road from Jerusalem to Jericho. Well, why would a priest be leaving Jerusalem on the road to Jericho unless he lives somewhere else besides in Jerusalem? And why go through Jericho? He probably lives in Galilee. So we've got an example, I think anyway, of a Judean priest, Zechariah, and a Galilee priest, an unnamed one, in Luke 10 and verse 31. Okay, then back to our story here in Luke chapter 1. He and his wife are very old. They're righteous people. They've done the will of God. They've kept all the liturgy and ceremony. They've obeyed the law of Moses, we're told, verse 6. They were righteous before God, walking in all the commandments and ordinances of the Lord, blameless. But they didn't have a child because Elizabeth was barren. And they both were now well stricken in years. Now, it's too bad. That's a good old English term, well stricken. You picture someone just with one foot in the grave here. Stricken, it just means that he was an old man. You can be old and not well stricken. Stricken means you're almost in the grave, one foot in it. That's kind of a poor translation for today. I guess it was okay for 1611. But it doesn't mean that he was well stricken like he had arthritis or something. He never could be traveling all over Palestine lifting these heavy items and sacrificing and slaying animals if he's well stricken. But well stricken we would understand to mean he was an old man. They're both very, very old. Okay, then verse 8, it came to pass that while he executed the priest's office. Now, let's stop with this for just a moment. He's an old man, a very old man, with his wife. He is childless, and he is on his weekly service in Jerusalem. It is the time for his course, the course of Abijah, to come and fulfill their ministry. And he happens to be the one who's chosen to burn the sacred incense inside the temple. Finally, it falls to him to burn the incense inside the temple. Now, I say finally because look at this situation numerically. Let's go back and do some dividing here and get some numbers in our mind. If we take the estimate of Jeremias, that there are 18,000 ordinary priests, then if we divide them into 24 courses, you can write this down, I've already figured it out myself. If we divide them into 24 courses, that gives us 750 priests per course. Now, of course, you can't do it equally. There might be 601 and 900 in another, but we're just taking an average here. 750 priests per course, each course serving 2 non-consecutive weeks per year at the temple, not counting the 3 annual festivals. If we divide that by the 6.5 families, which make up each of those 24 courses for daily ministry, that gives us 115 priests per family for daily ministry. So you got 2 numbers here, 750 and 115. So for this week here at the temple, we have 750 men. 750 are going to spend 7 days in Jerusalem at the temple. then if this course is divided up into 6.5 families, then each one of these families, like family 1A over here, has 115 priests. This is on the average. Some would be more, some less. That would mean there are 115 men available to do whatever needs to be done on Monday. If they're given the first day, they're given Monday. We've got 115 for Tuesday, 115 for Wednesday, and so forth. Now, for Zechariah, what it means is that for 2 weeks then, each year, he comes to Jerusalem, not counting the festivals. We don't need to keep saying that. We're talking about their normal service, their ordinary service. 2 weeks out of the year, he would come along with the 749 other members of his particular course. Then he was one of 115 who, let's say, had their turn on Monday. The likelihood of being selected to burn incense on the altar is like one in a lifetime chance. Priests are getting older and dying. More men are reaching the age where they can enter the ministry of the priest. The number then would be increasing. It's fluctuating. If you end up with 9 families here, you're not even included then. It would be a once-in-a-lifetime chance. As a matter of fact, Jewish law even said that if your lot came up twice, then you were forbidden the second time to burn incense. That was a coveted thing to be allowed to do. Now, the high priest had the best position. He could go into the Holy of Holies. But here I'm talking about going beyond just the outside of the temple, where maybe the other 114 or 113 other priests for that day would be slaying animals and burning them on the altar and so forth. He got to go inside the temple. Now, there were responsibilities concerning the lampstand, concerning the table of shewbread or showbread, and especially concerning the altar of burnt incense. That was the coveted thing, to be selected to burn incense after the morning sacrifice and after the evening, twice a day sacrifice. Zechariah would be allowed to do this twice then. So what I'm trying to say is this was an opportunity of a lifetime for Zechariah. I think it's being stressed that he's an old man. According to Jewish law, since you can only do this once, he's never been selected before. They would cast lots. Notice verse, we've seen that already once before, but come down into verse 9. According to the custom of the priest's office, his lot was to burn incense when he went into the temple of the Lord. Well, verse 8 we read, it came to pass that while he executed the priest's office before God in the order of his course. Now, the order of the course speaks of the 24 weekly courses and then X number of families per weekly course then. The order of his course, according to the custom of the priest's office, his lot was to burn incense when he went into the temple of the Lord. So it's interesting that in this opportunity of a lifetime, a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity, the lot happened to be cast for him that morning. Really, it was done the evening before to see who would get to go in with the incense the next morning. It came up with the number for Zechariah. Out of the 114 other people available on an average, it came up for him to do that. Now, of course, what we find here is that as he does go in, he and his wife have prayed diligently for a son. Verse 13, not only do they not have one, verse 7, but they're not taking it laying on their back. They're not just accepting that as fate or the will of God. They have prayed diligently for a son. And I find it interesting that in Scripture, the burning of incense is a type of prayers. Revelation 5:8. So God saw fit to answer this man's prayer when he went in and did that which typified the prayers of the saints. The burning and the offering up of incense. Look in Revelation chapter 5 and verse 8. When he had taken the book, now this is in the heavenly throne and kingdom though. The 4 living creatures and 24 elders fell down before the Lamb, having every one of them harps and golden vials full of odors. Well, that's incense, as you see in the margin, full of not just odors, but what produce odors? Well, incense, specially concocted incense, which are the prayers of the saints. Revelation 5:8, which are the prayers of the saint. So you see, everything in the tabernacle, and therefore everything in the temple, did serve, no question about it, a typical function. Everything served a typical function. And we're told in some places of the Bible, and other things are just left to our own imagination, well, what did that certain item or thing or function or capacity or ministry in the temple, what did that typify for eternal truth, or maybe in the Christian church? Well, the offering up of incense typified prayer, was a type of prayer. And so it's as he is burning the incense that the angel appears on the right side of the altar, verse 11. When Zechariah saw him, he was troubled, and fear fell upon him. But the angel said unto him, Fear not, Zechariah, for thy prayer is heard. See, that's how we know he's not just taking this passively. He's been praying about the fact that he doesn't have a child, neither does his wife, and they're old. Luke makes sure we realize it's a miracle that takes place here. It's on the order of an Abraham and Sarah type miracle. They're past the age of bearing children, and not only that, but the same thing that was true with Sarah, that is, she was barren during her childbearing years, is true with Elizabeth. Verse 7, Elizabeth was barren. Same thing is true. So I think it may be a real profitable adventure, and I'll let you do this in your own spiritual study. We don't have time to do it tonight, to find out, well, what are, obviously, an analogy is intended between Zechariah and Elizabeth and their son, and Abraham and Sarah and their son. Why all the similarities here? The barrenness. You know, you could be old and have born children earlier, but now you're past the age. Not only were they both past the age, they were both barren during the time when they could bear children. That would be a profitable spiritual endeavor, I think, to say, well, what now is Luke trying to say to us? He knows that we're going to know the Old Testament, or God, the Holy Spirit, who's inspiring this account in Luke, will know that we know the Old Testament story. So what are the similarities in the birth, and maybe especially in the children that are born? Isaac being Abraham and Sarah's son, and John the Baptist being that son of Zechariah and Elizabeth. Okay, so I guess I'll just conclude with the ordinary priest. You can read the whole account yourself, but those verses 5 through 13, I think, are the important ones. They give us some of the background that we're looking at in ITP anyway for the ordinary priest. They are not, however, as I've said before, part of the priestly aristocracy. As a matter of fact, they came to resent the power and the wealth that the priestly aristocracy possessed. And Acts chapter 6 and verse 7 may be one other place where we see an interesting reference made to the ordinary priests. We've looked at that before as to how people who were never allowed inside the temple would ever know what took place in the temple, the rending of the veil. Well, priests who went in and saw it could have been converted to early Christianity and could have then told the story to fellow Christians. But what I find interesting in Acts chapter 6 and verse 7, where we have essentially, I just paraphrase, give you part of it, and a great company of the priests was obedient to the faith, we've got ordinary priests. That may appear a little unusual in the New Testament or in the book of Acts, because generally the religious leaders are not the ones who are ever converted. They have too much to lose. They don't give up their position. Religious leaders are not the ones to convert. Their people convert, not the leaders. Well, if you understand who the ordinary priests were, they're not exactly leaders. They're not a part of the aristocracy. They aren't like the others with a lot to lose. They have a lot to gain to convert. They don't have the wealth and the power and the influence that numbers 1 through 6 on our list have. So perhaps with that you can grasp the reality of Acts 6-7 a little better.